Welcome to It's an Inside Job, the podcast where we equip you with actionable skills to build resilience, enhance communication, foster well-being, and lead and coach with impact. I'm your host, Jason Lim, and every Monday we bring you expert insights and real-world stories to help you thrive and succeed. And with that said, let's slip into the stream. Hey folks, welcome back to the show. I hope you've had a great weekend and welcome back to another long-form discussion that I have on Mondays. This week I'm joined by the inspiring and insightful Dr. Gary Crotaz. Now, Gary is a world-renowned executive coach, award-winning author, and the host of the Unlock Moment Leadership podcast. Originally trained as a medical doctor, his career spans from the ballroom, where he was a professional dancer, to the boardroom, where he held executive roles at Mothercare and Selfridges Group. His thought-provoking insights have been featured in The Telegraph, The Sunday Times, Stylist, and Forbes. And if you are on TikTok, and I need to get on that, you might be among the 8 million viewers of his coaching content. So in today's conversation, we dive deep into the concept of unlock moments. Those rare, transformative flashes of clarity that reveal our true purpose and direction. And here's what you can expect from today's episode. The first is the power of the unlock moment. We unpack how these pivotal moments of clarity can serve as a catalyst for life-changing decisions. Drawing from Gary's personal story of leaving medicine to pursue his passion for coaching and leadership, he also shares a number of other brilliant and fascinating stories of his clientele and the guests on his podcast. The second thing we're going to talk about is practical strategies for overcoming challenges. Gary's going to share actionable frameworks for navigating life's challenges and complexities, those obstacles that throw up as roadblocks sometimes. Whether you're feeling stuck or struggling to align your priorities with your goals, I think you're going to find this conversation very insightful. And the third thing, among many, that's the importance of reflection and purpose. We're going to explore how quieting the mind, creating space for self-reflection, and asking better questions, how they can help us guide to uncover our deepest motivations and to live a more intentional life. So this episode is packed with tools, stories, and strategies to help you uncover your own unlock moments. So with that said, let's slip into the stream and meet Dr. Gary Crotaz. Could we kick off the conversation by you introducing who you are and what you do?
Fantastic. Well, so today I am a coach and a podcaster and a speaker and an author. I've been on an eclectic journey to get there. My original training was as a medical doctor. I never practiced as a doctor actually, but I spent 10 years in strategy consulting, management consulting. Then I moved into retail. I was a senior executive leader in retail and retrained as a coach in the pandemic. So around 2020, I started my coaching journey. And now I coach clients around the world, a lot of senior executives, a lot of families, so business owning families, those kinds of people. And then my secret double life along that journey was also as a competitive professional ballroom dancer. So yeah, I've seen many different angles of career, and I do a lot of work today with people who are often sort of mid-career and going, right, what do I really want to do with the next chapter of my life?
Your podcast is The Unlock Moment, and this is what you talk about in many of your episodes with people around the world. Perhaps we could kick off by you maybe operationally defining what you mean by the unlock moment.
So I didn't realize, I always realized that I was interested in moments in my life and career journey and in other people's lives and career journeys, but I didn't call it the unlock moment until a few years ago when I was working with a particular coaching client over quite a long period of time. And he was grappling with a question that was very simple but very difficult. And that question was, do I want to pursue the things that make me successful, or do I want to pursue the things that make me happy? And for him, he felt as though those two were in conflict. And we were talking for a long time. He was grappling with that for a long time. And then one day, maybe 6 months into the journey, he texted me one day at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I've got it. I figured it out. I want to pursue happiness. What do you think? And I said a very non-coaching thing, which was yes. And he went, why are you so sure? I said, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. You've woken up. Is it that clear to you? And then I was like, that's like an unlocked moment. It's like a moment so clear, unexpected, that maybe that's really significant for him. And he came on, so he is episode number 1 of the podcast. He's called Sam Horton. He's an actor. And then he actually came on again, maybe 2 or 3 years into the podcast journey, and told his story of what happened next. And his life completely changed when he started making different choices when faced with a fork in the road. And then I started looking at my own journey and thinking about not the moments when I remember something sort of high profile happening. Like we remember the day when we quit our job, or we remember the day that maybe we got married or something like that. Unlocked moments are not necessarily those times. They could be. But an unlocked moment I describe as a sudden, remarkable moment of clarity in your life or career when you remember exactly where you were, who you were with, what you were thinking, when the unlocked moment happened. And the more I've talked to people about it, the more I've realized a very specific thing about it. It's a moment when you know a thing you didn't know before. It's not necessarily a moment when you made a decision. It's not necessarily a moment when you actually acted. So, for example, I talked to somebody on an early episode, and he said, I quit my corporate job and I retrained in facilitation and coaching and development. And I said, when did you know you were going to quit? And he said, 6 years before I quit. And I had a conversation with my boss, and I felt that they thought I was on a different path from the path I thought I was on. And I always knew then that I would quit, but it was just a question of finding the time. And when I talk to people about their unlocked moments, often their unlocked moments are walking down the corridor, looking out the window, doing the washing up, walking the dog. It's not at a time when there is something big going on. Sometimes there is, but sometimes it's just that, oh, yeah, I know the answer. So that's an unlocked moment. And when I talk to people about those moments, and I will just ask them the question, tell me of a time anywhere in your journey when you remember that sense of a sudden moment of clarity. And almost always people go, yeah, I know what that is. And they tell a story. Sometimes it's a story that they've told many times before and they've really thought about it. Sometimes they go, I've never talked about this before. Sometimes they go, I've never even really thought about it before, but now you ask me that question. Actually, this was the moment. This was the moment when I knew this thing. And then what I discovered over time, and this is what has made this for me something that started as a fascination or curiosity and is turning now more into, I think, a powerful tool to help people understand something, is I started seeing a connection between the story people told and their underlying sense of purpose. So I describe it as, it's like a lens on what you're really about, what you're really for. And I've started, I've had maybe 150 odd guests on the podcast of all different walks of life, all different countries around the world, all different levels of seniority, some in corporate, some entrepreneurs, some sports people, some in the arts. And this connection is when they tell me about what they do today or what they should do today, which is not necessarily what they're actually doing, there's a connection back to that story. For me, I said to you, I trained as a doctor. So I trained in medicine here in the UK where I live. And I spent 8 years in medical school. So I did all of the training, the lecture theatre work, the ward work, stethoscope around my neck, all of that, delivered babies, did a PhD in a science lab. And at the age of 27, I realized that it wasn't the career I wanted to pursue. And it wasn't that I'd been happy for 7 years up to that point. I'd been often quite unhappy and unfulfilled and frustrated, but I hadn't turned that into, well, you could do something different. And now I look back, I think, I remember my unlocked moment. My unlocked moment for me was walking down the corridor of the lab. Nothing else was happening. No one was around me. And this thought just landed in my head that was, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. It was as simple as that. It wasn't, you will leave. It wasn't, you will go and do something else. It wasn't, there's some other career that you're really excited by. It was just, you have permission to leave. You have permission to do a different career. That career may or may not be successful. You may or may not be happy doing it, but you have permission to explore that. And what came from that is I started exploring. And what came from that was I found something else that I found really interesting to do, and that was going into the consulting world for a decade. But that's a classic unlock moment because it was a moment of knowing a thing. When I link that to this thread of purpose, and this is something that I have only figured out quite recently when I'm putting it all together, is that thread for me is about freedom. For me, it would be different for different people, but that story I tell was, you are free. Other people may have a different opinion, and many of them did. Other people wouldn't have made the choices that I made, and that's fine. Other people would have said, you might be more successful, or you've invested all this time, whatever. And I was like, but I have freedom to ruin my career if I want to. I have permission to fail. When I then look at all the decisions that have happened through my career, those major turning points in the 20 years since, now I see the connection of freedom. And so when I'm trying to figure out my path today, I understand this underlying driver of freedom for me. So, I describe what I do today. I'm a coach, I'm a podcaster, I'm a speaker, I'm an author. I do a wide variety of different things, and I don't want to be tied down. I don't want to be in a role where I'm constrained and constricted, and that's about freedom. I could earn more money maybe if I did different things, but I wouldn't, because for me it's about freedom. So that's where the unlock moment has started to become really powerful for people, that they see a connection, they see a lens that they didn't see before by exploring a story that might have already been in their head, or might be something that they go searching for when answering the question, tell me about a time that felt like that. So that's the unlock moment.
Create Harmony is a podcast about setting an intentional rhythm and savoring God's blessings. In this place, we'll take a few minutes to celebrate everyday joys and remind ourselves how to notice goodness that is all around us. During the winter at Create Harmony, we shift our focus to all things cozy and snuggly. And while our days are shorter and darker, we stay attuned to the things that help us reset and restore. At the start of this new year, our podcast is filled with winter self-care, as well as ways to declutter and clear your mind. Check it out.
Yeah, so as you said, it's a sudden and remarkable moment of clarity. And as you said, for yourself and the 150 guests you've had, they've had this sudden and remarkable moment of clarity. Would you say that, people have a sense of purpose for a while? They get into college, or university, they have a sense of purpose of what they want to do, but purpose sometimes changes. And what I hear about what you're saying is, originally you had a purpose going to medical school to be in the service of others and in the medical field per se. And then something happened through the experience of going through working in the lab, working in the hospital, getting your PhD, what have you. What happened was a value popped up. It sounds like you had a moving toward value, this sense of freedom, this sense of being able to find autonomy or agency. And did that value, did it evolve over time? Was it something that you were maybe subconsciously and consciously processing, Gary? And that time you were walking down the lab or the hall, and then it just came to you and said, not what you have to do, but here's another option.
It's a really great question. And I love that we're exploring this live in the moment, because I haven't thought about that question before, the way you've asked that. And what comes to mind is, very deliberately, when I talk about the unlock moment, what it's giving you is not understanding what your purpose is. I describe it as understanding your deepest underlying sense of purpose. And I use that word deliberately because I think that generally what I'm seeing when I see a true unlock moment, and not everybody has them, not everybody has that story, but what it unlocks is something that I think was already there, but was maybe invisible to the person. So I don't think that, when you say, did I have purpose going to medical school? I do, but it's kind of like small p purpose. So I was at school, I did sciences, I was good at it. I applied to medical school because I wanted to help people. Not wrong. Freedom is a much deeper, more visceral, more human connection to purpose. And I think when I look back to who I always was, I was always somebody that felt like I wanted to defy convention a little bit. And maybe one of the reasons why I felt like a square peg in a round hole in medicine is that sense of your job as a medical student, your job as a doctor is to acquire the body of knowledge and the body of experience that enables you to have a patient in front of you and help to diagnose and treat what's going wrong with them. There's not a huge space actually for individuality in that, because there is, more and more now with modern medicine, there is a right answer in 99.9% of medicine, and your job is to find it. And I think I felt like I was being turned into a lookalike doctor, particularly with, algorithm medicine and, which is good medicine because it's more evidence-based and, there's less potential for you as a patient to feel like, well, my doctor knows the answer, but the other doctor didn't know the answer. The ideal is all doctors know the answer and you get the best treatment there is possibly available to you. So I think that we're tapping into something deeper. And I think about, there's a particular conversation that I had on the podcast with a coach who's based in New York. And the opening question that I ask, which is part of now what is emerging as a method of the unlock moment, there's three touch points. The third one, let me work backwards. The third touch point is, what do you do today, or what should you be doing today, based on what you now understand? The second touch point is, at some point along your journey, you might have had this remarkable moment of clarity, this unlock moment. The first touch point is, to understand the person you are today, where would we start in your story? So that's the first question I ask. To understand the person you are today, where do we start in your story? Some people will start right at the beginning. Some people will start last year, because they'll say, my life up until last year is not relevant to who I am today. And then I was diagnosed with cancer. And that defines who I am today, for example. And there's a connection between those three touch points. I did an interview with a coach based in New York, and we hadn't talked much before. And literally the first question I asked was, to understand the person you are today, where we start in your story? And she said, at the age of 4 was the first time that I understood the meaning of the word fear. And she was talking about her relationship with her father. And she was talking about a sort of some kind of psychologically abusive relationship, where in a certain culture, as a woman, she was, or as a girl, and then as a woman, she was very much sort of controlled the possession of her father until she was married, and then possession of her husband, that kind of culture. Then we talked about her unlock moment. Her unlock moment was at the age of 30, which is around about 20 years ago. And her unlock moment was, she was in a corporate role. She went to one of these kind of leadership retreats with a bunch of other mid-career people trying to figure out their purpose and all of that. And her father found out and didn't like it and showed up. So she's in a room with all of these people, similar age, going, what's our vision? What's our purpose? Big sort of energetic room. And then the door opens at the back of the room and her father walks in. And he walks up to her and tries to drag her out of the room because he thinks that she shouldn't be doing it. And she gets away and she goes up to the guy at the front, the facilitator, and she says, I'm scared. And he's like, why are you scared? My father's just come in. And he was like, why are you scared? because he's going to kill me, because he doesn't, actually kill me, but not like that. And then the facilitator, who was on the money, said to her, point out your father. And he was standing in the back. And he said, who's making you scared? And she went, my father. And he went, yeah, but he's just standing at the back of the room. Who's making you scared? And she was like, my dad. He's at the back of the room. You don't understand. He's making me scared. He said, who's making you scared? Because he's just standing there. And then she went, I'm making me scared. I'm making me scared. And that was her unlock moment. And what her unlock moment gave her as knowledge was, I know that I am in control of making me feel scared, and therefore I'm also in control of making myself feel not scared. And from that moment, she made decisions that changed her relationship with her family, and changed the path of her life and career, and involved her actually moving from Europe to the US, and her whole life went in a different direction. You have to understand both those touch points to understand this underlying sense of purpose of her going, I'm in control. That's my sense of purpose. So what I've discovered about the unlock moment is the nature of the moment, the nature of what people discover is really variable. Sometimes people's moments are something that's very personal, like that story. Sometimes somebody was in the middle of a car accident on the motorway, and he said, as my car was spinning across the carriageway, I remember my life flashing before my eyes and going, maybe this is it. And then he said, and the next thing that flashed through my head was, have I achieved the things that I want to do? And he went, I haven't. But my mentors, my people who I look up to in life had achieved so much by the time they were my age. And he survived the car crash, got out of the car and went, I'm 22. I better get on and start achieving these things. And so these moments are just so unique. And it's giving people a different lens. It's giving people a different angle, and often making a connection that they've not made before. And I never set out to be doing this. I didn't go, there's this thing, it's going to help people tap into their deepest underlying sense of purpose. Let's launch a podcast. I just started having conversations with people and being curious about these stories. And then when you've heard enough, you start seeing, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. And there are certain characteristics of those stories when it's really a powerful, true unlock moment. It's been an incredible journey, and I'm loving being on it.
Well, I mean, the stories you've told are quite fascinating, from someone getting cancer, so someone, crashing out on the highway or carriageway, as you call it, or whatever it is, or this coach in New York and such, based on whatever cultural background she had and the threat and such. I used to work with trauma way back in the day, 20 years ago plus. And it was just that for a lot of people, it became a wake-up call. It's understanding the narrative, because most of us are oblivious to the narrative that our brains are constantly telling us about the world and our place within that world. And it sounds like the unlock moment is as sudden as it may come to us, or how it evolves over time. It's a way of someone sort of knocking on our prefrontal cortex and saying, hello, time for this is a wake-up call. Look at it doesn't always have to be some sort of tragedy or something, but it's just like, what the hell am I doing? It could be just blasé, routine, Monday life, and like, what am I doing, right? Yeah. Or it could be a fantastic experience and that completely pivots them in like a 180 in a totally different direction. Think as you're telling these stories, I'm kind of relating my own life to it, right. But I find it hard for myself to pin down one unlock moment. I feel, at least for myself, I've had multiple unlock moments depending upon the phase in which I am in my life. And that's pivoted me towards different things. And it hasn't just been one evolution of a sense of purpose, but over time, experience, I've always believed she's the best teacher. And through those experiences, neutral, positive, negative, Gary, what it's done, it's kind of pulled the veil from my eyes in some sense and given me a deeper insight to be more introspective. And it's evolved my sense of purpose, which may be multi-pronged. It's not just like one defined sentence for me. But I found that I've had a number of these touch points that have kind of pivoted me over time. And I'm thankful to all those, both the negative and the positives and whatever. I don't even want to call them negative or positive, but on this valence between uncomfortable to comfortable, from intensity, from low to high intensity, what have you, right? The valence and the intensity of those moments of kind of, I've myself, again, sorry for ad-libbing here, but I've had these sort of multiple unlock moments for myself.
Should we have a go?
Sorry?
I'm going to ask you two questions then.
Okay.
So, and these are not questions to spark. This is not about your telling your life story. It's not about that at all. It's about the stories you choose to tell. So the first question is this one. In order to understand the person you are today, where would we need to start in your story?
I think maybe that was back, there's multiple, but the one that comes top of mind is probably grad school, when I was just outside of Chicago, when I was studying sort of clinical and cognitive sciences.
And what is it about that time that makes it the start point?
At that point, I met my current wife, my wife, and she had that Scandinavian glow. That's why I am in Norway the last 25 years.
Yeah.
And there was just, I was going to a career. I was going to start working in Chicago at a rehab hospital and such. But when I met her back in 95, it just, I don't know. I mean, I've been on dates and such and with women, but it was something about her that, just lit my fire. And we traveled back and forth, in the mid 90s between Norway, and I was a dirt poor student, and, so was her. So was she. So we were flying back between Chicago and Oslo. And at the end of my grad studies, it was, I just knew that, she said, "Do you think you could come to Norway for a year?" And I said, yeah, let's do it. Right. I had a great job all set up in Chicago, high paying, blah, blah, blah. It was down my values. I was going to help people and such. But this overwhelmed everything. So I think that was one huge pivotal point where I moved from, I'm originally Canadian, so I moved to the States to study. And then after my grad studies, I hop across the pond to the land of the Vikings, and I find myself, here in Oslo, Norway. So I think maybe that's a long answer, but that's
a start point.
Yeah.
So when you think back and you remember, and you describe, most people would say, I can think of many times, but I'm going to ask you to tell one story about a remarkable moment of clarity when you remember exactly where you were, who you were with, what you were thinking, when you knew a thing you didn't know before. What comes to mind?
Based on what I just told you, or just something else? It could be anything.
Somewhere in your story.
I guess about a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And this is something I've been fighting with and such. And, when I got diagnosed with that became a very stark moment of clarity. That I run, similar to you, a podcast host. I write for a magazine. I'm not an author yet. But, and I also do coaching through my company, Mind Talk. And then what really came apparent, I had that shock moment. And I guess, Gary, you probably heard this multiple times, but my family, that was it. That became the one thing, for my kids, my son and my twin daughters and my wife. I've always known it, but until you get a wake-up call like that, where, well, it could be the end of things. I could end up 6 feet in the ground. But my point is, I'm not saying that's a bad moment for me. It's a valence. It has a certain valence and intensity to it that kind of woke me up even to a greater extent. It allowed me to articulate both cognitively, emotionally, physiologically, psychologically, at a deeper level, truly, truly what is important to me, right? I'm healthy per se per now. You know, I have my strength, I have my energy, I have things. I'm going through treatment, and it's working. But it's something I live with, right? It's something that hit me, and hopefully I come through it. I don't know when, but what is real, that became the most salient moment, the wake up call for me that really pivoted. And I pour my heart into the podcast. I pour my heart into helping my clients, because what's even become much more salient to me is one of my values. Yours is freedom. That is one of mine too, but it's also to be in the service of others, to help people through their things. You know, many people don't know what I've gone through. This is kind of the first time I've kind of really said it. You know, I have some clients that know about it, but that became the most pivotal point, I guess, up to my 5+ decades on this planet.
I'm really sorry to hear that you're going through that, but I wish you all the best with
yeah.
your treatment.
I mean, these things happen. These things happen, man.
Tell me about, in that journey, is there a specific moment that comes to mind when you talked about family became the one thing?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember being in a place, in a conversation, or on your own when that became super clear?
Give me a sec. I have to rewind the mental clock here. I guess after the diagnosis, that hits you full. Logically, I understood. Emotionally, it took me time to process what that actually meant. And I think it was sitting in we have a summer home down in the south along the coast. And I was sitting there with my wife, and we were just eating, I can't remember, I think it was sushi or something, and just looking out on the coast, looking out across the farmland towards the ocean. And that became... That really kind of sank in. I think at that point, my brain had actually emotionally processed it. My nervous system kind of absorbed it, and it's like, okay, this is where you're at. This is not a bad or a good thing. It's just some, excuse my French, the shit that's hit you. Now you've got to deal with it. And what also came to mind, my brain threw out a metaphor, I guess, or a picture in my mind of a hurricane or a tornado. And you can't escape this. I mean, you got to fight it. But what I did, I decided to retract into the eye of that storm where it's calm, and then try to escape it. And as you know, Gary, as we talked about, the idea for me of resilience and equanimity and finding mental, emotional, and physiological well-being, those are core things for me. And that's what I wrap my head around. I have dark moments. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Mm-hmm. But that was my point. Sitting at my cottage dining table with my wife, looking out over we have these beautiful big sort of cathedral windows that look out onto the ocean and such. And that's when it hit me.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. You could have picked any story to start. You picked that one. You could have picked any of a number of stories to talk about your unlocked moment. You talked about that one and you shared that. And I'm really grateful you did. It's really powerful. Both of them are all about family. You start your story with a wife. You talked about your unlocked moment and you said, family became the one thing. And so, it's a great example of, there's a lot of things that are important to you. And what you do is about helping people and about resilience and all of those kinds of things. Deepest underlying sense of purpose, what I hear in those two stories, is family. And different people would describe that in different ways. And they would come to different points of connection. But that's what I hear in those two. I interviewed a woman called Oa Hackett, who is a cancer survivor, and she runs a small charity in East England called Little Lifts. She was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 28 years old. And when you get into not just the area, but exactly what you did, and you said, and this was the moment. I was looking out of the cathedral windows of our summer house, sitting next to my wife and thinking about this. That's the unlocked moment. It's not when I was diagnosed with cancer, which is a period of time. It's a specific moment. And when you hone in on that, it tells you something. So I talked to Oa and I said, when was your unlock moment? And she said, I can tell you exactly when it was. I was sitting in my chemotherapy planning meeting with my oncologist in front of me and my husband on one side and my mum on the other side. And she said, and I felt so alone. And I said, and what did you know in that moment that you didn't know before? And she said, I knew that I was strong enough to get through this.
Mm.
And that's what she knew. And she didn't plan, before she got cancer, to set up and run a charity. But that's what she came out to do. And she said, I've come through this and I know what I needed, as well as the medicine and the doctoring and all of that. I needed the little things that helped, that only people who'd gone through what I had gone through knew. You need a soft toothbrush. You need, certain types of food, not other types of food. And so she started creating these little boxes, which were full of the kinds of things that you would only know you need if you've been through it. And I think now they've distributed something like 20,000+ boxes to breast cancer patients, across the UK. And it comes back to that moment for her. I describe her moment as alone with others. So you've got people around you who love you, care for you, support you. But in that moment, and you will understand this better than I do, it's also only you. It's only you in that moment. And it's only you who can carry you through. And the heart of that resilience is knowing that you are on this journey and that you will go step by step by step forward.
In part one, we explored the curious concept of the unlock moment, which Gary defined as a sudden and profound moment of clarity that reveals something new about our purpose and direction in life. Now, Gary explained how these moments often serve as a catalyst for significant life changes, and shared his own journey from being a medical doctor to a coach and speaker, driven by his underlying sense of purpose, which was freedom. We also discussed how identifying and embracing these pivotal moments can unlock new paths in our own professional and personal lives. Gary illustrated this with examples from his own life, including the moment he realized he had permission to leave the medical field and pursue a career that aligned with his values. And I also shared my own unlock moment, and that came during my cancer diagnosis. A moment when I truly recognized the importance of my family while sitting with my wife, looking out at the ocean at my cottage. Together we reflected on how these moments are often tied to a specific place, a time, and a realization, and how they can guide us toward what truly matters. And these unlock moments, they're not something we can plan for. They just hit us out of the blue. It could be walking the dog. It could be taking a bus on a Tuesday afternoon back home after work. It could be through an accident or a story or something we read, an experience we have. That becomes an eye-opener that pulls away the veil. And something that's has always been part of us is revealed for the first time with such clarity, with such salience. And the question I pose to you as we move into part two, what has been your unlock moment?
When you get to really the heart of it, and it's, often people will say to me, they come on the podcast and they'll say, oh yeah, I know what that is. I always talk about this thing, and I'm like, that's not your unlock moment. That's not your unlock moment. It's an important moment. Yeah. It's a critical moment. Absolutely. Now tell me more about this. And they'll go, oh, there's a guy that came on the podcast. He's a really, really nice guy, and a good friend. And he's a really experienced coach and speaker in the US. And so he's told his life story many, many, many times. And he's very professionally experienced in the way that he delivers that story. And in some sense, you kind of get that sense that he's told it many times before, and he's really good at doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's quite a story of success. And then we honed in on a moment when actually he was vulnerable, and he never tells that story. And he was talking about leading a team, and his team came up to him and said, actually, you need to understand that we're not getting this thing from you that we need. And what did you know in that time that you didn't realize before? And he was like, I knew that I needed to listen and learn and change and be humble. Mm. And actually, for him, I think that was an interesting journey, because it's not that he's not humble today, he is, but he's slick and practiced and performed, and you kind of lose touch with the vulnerability sometimes when you tell the story over and over again. So it comes through in very many different ways. And I think what I see in people, you know the data on this, that people who feel as though they live their life every day with purpose, with their deepest underlying sense of purpose, are 6 times more likely to describe themselves as being resilient, and are 4 times more likely to describe themselves as feeling healthy. And it's because they choose intentionally to do what they're doing, and they choose intentionally to make certain life compromises. So for me, I'm every day making compromises on my maximum earning potential for freedom. So I got approached for a job a few weeks ago, and in the moment, it was a really interesting opportunity. And in the moment I said, but I don't want a job. And I knew that, and I'm really clear on that, because freedom. I probably would have been less clear on that a few years ago, before I'd really got into understanding what I understand now, having had all these conversations with people and understanding their sense of purpose. And now I feel, well, I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing. Not because it's podcasting or not because it's coaching. It's because it's in freedom. And I don't know whether in 20 years' time I'll still be coaching. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that I will be doing something that feels free, whatever it is. I don't think that I will be in a place where I feel out of control and constrained by others.
When you talked about sort of small P and big P of purpose, and a lot of people, they understand what purpose is and they understand what values are, but they can seem very intangible in abstract terms, right? Especially in the corporate world, it gets so watered down. It's like synergy or challenge, right? Per se, or mission and vision. But what I hear is you're very nuts and bolts when it comes to purpose and then it comes to values. And someone's going, my life is great right now, but everything's on the rails. But I don't know the difference I cannot delineate between what is a small purpose and what is a large purpose. How do I truly know what is a deeper purpose? And if we ask them, like these really eloquent questions, you ask to find that unlock moment. And if they come up against the wall, just to challenge you says, you know what? Everything's been flowing in my life pretty well. I don't have one of these moments that you speak of, these people that you speak of, Jason or John or Jill or Jack or whoever. They had significant moments, but I don't feel I have that. If we come back to that, if someone's thinking that now, one of our listeners are thinking, I really don't know what my purpose is. I just kind of clock on every day and, I love what I do, but I don't know truly what my purpose is or what the values are. How do you walk someone through that? What can you suggest, Gary?
I'll tell you about the book that I failed to write. So, I've been planning on writing the book of the Unlocked Moment for a couple of years. And I spent 18 months staring at a blank sheet of paper going, I don't know how to write this book. But what the book was I was like, wouldn't it be great if there were a book you pick off the shelf and it walks you through the recipe of how to find your unlocked moment? And I was like, I'm sure there are 4 dimensions or 6 dimensions of an unlocked moment. I can describe them and illustrate them with stories. Wouldn't that be a great book? And I kept looking at the blank sheet of paper. And then I had a little moment and I went, yeah, because there's not a recipe. There's not a recipe for finding an unlocked moment. And then I started looking differently. And I said, what are the things in common when people discover an unlocked moment? And one of the things that is really in common is that the times they describe were not a time when they were sitting down trying to figure it out. So I don't think that a great way to find your unlocked moment is to go, I need to figure out my unlocked moment, and then it'll all be great. Even though, wouldn't it be great if we all could discover our unlocked moment? And I can certainly ask some questions and share questions for people to explore to find it. But so often, the moment is a very benign moment. I was sitting in a meeting, slightly zoning out, and then I suddenly realized that I wasn't emotionally aligned with the people around me. And this is a guy called Tony Martignetti, who's based in the US. And he said, my unlocked moment was realizing they weren't in it in the way that I was. And I got up and I walked out of the meeting and out of the job. So he quit his job in the middle of a meeting because he looked around at the people and went, these people are not me. And he said, I learned that I want to leave the room to change the room. That's the way he described it. So I think that what you have to do to give yourself a good chance of understanding your unlocked moment is you need to quiet your conscious mind. And so often people are walking the dog, doing the laundry, looking out the window. Micah Libran, who's one of Gallup's top strengths coaches who recently left the Gallup organization, I think she's one of the people that understands unlocked moments better than almost anybody. She said it's like lifting a curtain to see something that was already there, but we weren't seeing it. That's what she describes it like. And then I talk a lot about time. And I say, like my actor, Sam, who was, episode number 1 of the podcast, he couldn't answer that question until he'd sat with it long enough. And he said, I can't tell you how frustrating it was, feeling like I'm sitting on it going, surely I should be able to figure out, is the success or happiness more important as my sort of goal? And it came to him just when it had processed for enough time. So what I say to people is, understand that it's important to you to figure it out. Understand that you're ready to explore. Find yourself places and headspace to think and to just sort of calm the conscious mind. So I don't normally find people finding their unlocked moments when they're working 6 days a week into 10 p.m. at night, every night, and they're half burned out. Although sometimes the moment of burnout can be an unlocked moment. So I say to people, start to just get out of your head a bit and get out of your normal environment. Go for a walk, go on a little road trip, something like that. Just get to a new place. You were describing being in the summer house, looking out of the cathedral windows. You weren't in your normal environment. And then your brain was able to do its thinking. I'd say, let your brain have the space and time to do the thinking it needs to do. And then you may not find it. Sometimes it takes a long time. And then the other place time comes in is sometimes there is this moment of clarity. You might not see in the moment that is the moment of clarity. When you look back, you'll go, that was it. There can be a significant time between having that moment of clarity and acting on it. At the short end of the spectrum, there's a guy called Andy Martignello, who's a world-leading coach based in Toronto, actually. And he said, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, stressed, and it wasn't the first time. And my headspace was, 4 o'clock again, doing this again. And then he went, I got to do something about it. And he went downstairs, he got a piece of paper, and he started to write his plan. And he said, by 7 a.m., I had started sending emails out to some people I knew really well. And by 12 o'clock, I was in a process that led to me getting a different job. And he said, so my unlocked moment, 4 a.m., this can't go on, to acting was about 3 hours. 7 a.m. sending the emails, and it changed. I think about a month later, he was in a new job. For Richard Oshibanjo, who's chief of staff at Intel and also a coach, actually, he was a PhD, well, he was a chemist, and his father was a PhD chemist, and he went into chemistry. And he said, at the age of 18, I knew that I wasn't going to follow chemistry as my career, but it was another 10 years before I felt able to tell my father that. So he stayed in chemistry to the age of 28 and then went, Dad, this is actually not what I want to do. So, and when did you know, Richard? At 18. So there can be a really long gap between knowing and doing. And that's a real sort of characteristic of unlock moments. So the bit you're in control of, in answer to your question, the bit you're in control of is give your brain the space and time to do the thinking it needs to do. And then you have to kind of wait. It's not something you can force. It's not something that you can make happen. There isn't a recipe book. There are great questions, but you might not know the answers to those questions, and that's okay. I was asking myself questions at the age of 22, 23, 24, 25, going, why am I not enjoying this more? Why haven't I not found a medical specialty that really inspires me? Why am I not happy yet? None of those questions felt like the answer was you could do something else, ever. It was just keep going. Next week you're doing surgery, then you're going to do cardiology, then you're going to do pediatrics. Maybe you'll love those. That's my mindset going through medical school. And then at 27, I went, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. And from there, I went to the careers fair and went, what on earth does somebody with a medical degree do if they're not a doctor? I have no idea. And I looked at all these different career paths, and I discovered consulting, which I knew nothing about. And then I discovered that consulting was like problem solving with no knowledge. But medicine is problem solving with 17 textbooks full of knowledge. And I was like, oh, this is more interesting, because for me, I was resisting the you must acquire the knowledge in order to be the expert. So yeah, that's kind of how that journey kind of goes.
Yeah, there's just two things to that. As you said, it may not be sitting down with a notebook with the specific questions and then sort of articulating your answer for each question. Maybe it is an evolution of thought. I remember when my kids they're in their 20s and their late teens now. And I used to go to, my parents are from Notting Hill. And so I used to go to Notting Hill in London for my summers. And so based here in Oslo, I'd have everything around me. This would be my bubble. And what I would do is I would travel to London for 3 days, and I'd have a small backpack, moleskin, and I would just walk the streets of London. I would just walk my old neighborhoods and walk and walk and walk. Nothing, no purpose in mind, but it was to allow my brain to play in a new novel atmosphere. Not novel, I mean, I've been to London hundreds of times, but the novelty of that weekend as opposed to my life here in Oslo, it allowed my brain to think at a whole different level. I had nothing planned, right? It's like I'd stop here for lunch, I'd stop here for dinner, I'd go to Leicester Square or whatever. But I would just walk. And through that, just with the moleskin, I would write down ideas as they would pop. Some that are just silly or stupid, some were I thought were profound for myself. But it was just through that process of what you're saying, it allowed me to get in touch with the narrative going through my head. And it was through the fluidity of physiology of just walking that my psychology would open up, and the veil would be pulled away, and I'd see multiple narratives, and to see what would really sort of entice me or attract me towards it. So I just wanted to say that, because I think what that insight you had is a very astute. It's maybe not a fixed formulaic plan. It's just like, get out of your bubble a little, and just, not your vernacular, but my vernacular, get out of your bubble and just let your brain play with different things, right? Yeah. And the other thing that was just my story to add on to yours, but I was wondering, my question back to you, you coach multiple people in different corporations, different walks of life, both as guests on your podcast, but also as clients. But you were talking about in your early 20s when you're going through your medical education and such. And I was wondering, do you think it's usually easier for older people, maybe in their 30s, 40s, 50s, because of life experience, they've been through the gauntlet per se, for them to have a better moment, an unlock moment? Because someone who's younger, let's say in their late teens or in their early 20s, when they're just sort of discovering themselves as they come out, I was wondering, what's your perspective on sort of, age when it comes to unlocking the moment, figuring out our purpose?
It's a really interesting question. I think that I, like you, would make the assumption that with more life experience comes more opportunity for unlock moments. I think in reality, I think that is probably true, but I've heard them in people who are in their late teens, and I've heard them in people having them in their mid-70s. So I was working with a coaching client who was in their mid-70s, and we were talking about, actually in the next chapter of her kind of hybrid, half retirement, half career phase that she was in at that stage. And she was going, of these options, what do I want to do next? And I asked the question in a coaching context, well, what do you want? And then she stopped. And then she said, I've never asked myself that question. I've never truly asked myself the question, just, what do you want? I've always asked myself the question, of the options in front of me, which one is the better one? Of the things that people like me, in my career journey would do, what kinds of things would I go on to do? And I said, no, that's not the question I'm asking you. I'm asking you the question, just what do you want? And then she said, well, when you asked me that question, none of the things in front of me. But what she was doing was she was looking at a list of things going, how do I weigh them up? And then she said, what I really want is, and then she described something completely different, which wasn't on her list. And I said, well, could you do that? And she went, I don't know, because I've never thought about it. And I said, well, how could you know? So very simple questions, but what it's doing is it's opening up exploration back to that deepest underlying thing of what's really underneath. Often what we're looking at is the superficial. So even, earlier when you were describing what you do and why you do it and who you do it for, at no point in that were you describing in your sort of, if you like, your public narrative, family. And then when you talk about the stories, and it's not about this becoming part of the public narrative, but when we talk about the stories, it's clear that that family thing is deeply important to you. And for you to sort of, place that in a space. But what that does is helps you to look at the public narrative, the choices about what you do today in a different way. So this person I was working with let go of a lot of things that in reality were society saying, well, you should be doing these things. Other people who were influential or encouraging, had a vested interest in her doing some certain things, were being very convincing. And then she started to go, no, but that's actually not what I want. So I'm happy to help you, but it's not what I want. She got a new job about a year later in the White House. And that job would not have come around if she hadn't asked the question, what do I want? So it was a really fascinating journey. At the other end of the spectrum, I was just in a conversation over breakfast with a married couple. And we were meeting because I was mainly meeting the wife in the couple. And we were talking about the unlock moment. And her husband was sitting there, and we're all chatting away. And then I'm talking with wife and we're chatting, and he's sort of sitting there quietly. And we talk about unlock moments. And then, I don't know, he was probably sitting there quietly for 10 or 15 minutes. And he suddenly pipes up with, I know what my unlock moment was. And we both stop and look at him. And he said, when I was 12 years old, my dad said to me that he didn't think I was ever going to come to anything great. And actually, that was a moment. And I said, and what did you know then that you didn't know before? And he went, that I was going to prove him wrong. And his wife turned around and she made a connection suddenly that she hadn't seen before as to why he's driven in the way that he's driven. And he said, I haven't really ever thought about that conversation, but now you're asking me to think about that. That's my moment. And I hear that quite a lot. People's unlock moments are not necessarily at the age of 30 or 40 when they quit a job. Sometimes it's
Sure. Yeah.
But sometimes they're much more fundamental things. So I worked with emerging biotech executive in the UK. And her unlock moment was when her grandmother was dying, and the doctor came to talk to her when she was, I don't know, a young to mid teenager, and said, "There's nothing more we can do because she's old, and that's just getting old, and that's what happens in life." And they were being comforting of a teenage girl, of course. And I said, "What did you know then that you didn't know before?" And she said, "Well, I knew that I was going to try and disprove him. And I was going to try and disprove that age is something that happens that you can just go, well, we don't have to try." And she said, "Oh, what I've discovered then in my undergrad and my PhD and my postdoctoral studies into aging, longevity and aging, which is what she went into, is aging is just a series of diseases and they're treatable." And then she made a discovery that is so remarkable that the early funding round, like the seed funding round for her organization, is in the multi-millions. And when you see her results that have been reproduced by other labs, you go, nobody would believe that. Nobody would believe that you're able to arrest the aging process in the way that you've done with already existing drugs on the market, but you've thought about it in a different way, and you're applying a different drug regime, not a high-cost drug regime, but a different drug regime to treating aging. And it all comes from that unlock moment. And then I said to her, "If we wanted to understand the person you are today, where we need to start in your story?" And she said, "Oh, that's easy. At 7 years old, I was the rebel in the family. I was a tomboy. And I was the one that was always asking questions." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And then at 15, whatever, when the doctor came and said aging is inevitable, your response is it? And you're asking that question. And what you're now doing is you're asking questions of the entire science community to say, is it okay that we've just decided that aging is untreatable and it's okay to go at some point, that's it, you're just old? And I said, now I understand why you do what you do. And honestly, you're much more investable. Because I want to invest in the person that keeps asking brilliant questions and is a biotech executive more than I want to invest in the person that was lucky and got a great result one day, because I don't know whether you're going to have another one. But now I understand that you're the rebel who's constantly asking questions of authority and established orthodoxy. That's fascinating. And she was like, "Oh, I'd never thought about it that way before." I was like, there you go.
You've spoken to some fascinating people. I need to get some of these people on my show too. Not that you're not fascinating or my other guests, but it's very interesting to talk about it. Yeah. I have a challenging question for you. So a lot of people may discover, oh, this is what I want to do, a sense of purpose, a sense of value. But what I experience a lot of times, now the people you've talked about have been able to bridge this threshold. They say, I want to do this. My next question, usually to challenge them, to understand the underlying motivation and the drive. What are you willing to do in order to achieve what you want? And a lot of the times, I don't know any percentage, but let's just say 50%. They're not willing to do what it's necessary in order to achieve what they want. Now, that may be because they are in some sort of dire straits. They're working 3 jobs. They don't have the flexibility to go back to get that education, do what they want. They may have aging parents and they're a single mom or a single dad, and they have to take care of aging parents and small kids. And there's not that viability of time and such. What do you recommend? Now, I'm not asking for a panacea here, Gary, but what is your recommendation in order to make that leap from I want to I'm willing to do this to get what I want?
That's such a good question. I think you're describing 2 different scenarios there. So let me talk about them one after the other. The first one is I can't, and the second one is I won't. So the I can't is I'm extremely financially constrained. I've got caring responsibilities. I can't move to Oslo. I can't just quit my job, whatever. So and I really understand that. I do quite a lot of work in coaching with institution in the UK where I'm working with the most junior people in the organization.
Sure.
In that scenario, I work with this framework of control. And if you think of a spectrum, so you draw a line in front of you and you go, one end of the spectrum is I have no control. At the other end of the spectrum is I have full control. And then there's a spectrum in between. What we generally feel like and what society and people around us make us feel like is if you haven't got control, you've got no control. So you're either one end or the other end. And if you're in that situation we've just described, generally it feels pretty much like you have no control. I can't do anything because I haven't got the money, or, circumstances around me, my kids in school, whatever it is. And then I say, well, how can you move a bit up that spectrum? So we very rarely in life, anybody, have full control. And we also very rarely have no control at all. And so I go, well, if you feel like really, really you've got 10% control, how could you move 10 to 20? How could you move 20 to 30? And when I'm working in this institution with these people in the lowest paid roles in the organization, what they've discovered is that they have more control than they thought because, for example, they can ask for help, but they weren't asking for help. They can ask somebody more senior to give them some mentorship. And surprise, surprise, when they do that, most of the time the person goes, oh, I'm really grateful to be asked. I'd love to spend a bit of time with you and help you out. Sometimes they realize that they can get a bit more flexibility, or they might be able to ask for, more pay for different responsibilities, or they might be able to move sideways into a role that has, different choices ahead. There's all sorts of little things, which isn't about getting you to 90% control, but it moves 10 to 20, 20 to 30. So for those people I'm talking about, we all recognize that you're really constrained, but how can you move it a bit? For the people who are not in that situation, who are more in, I won't change, or I'm not changing. I could, but I'm in the habit of not changing. So I often see this with mid to senior executives who, for example, who are rather used to earning a good salary and having a nice life. And they go, well, I don't really want to give up my nice car and 3 holidays a year in the Greek islands and whatever. And I, well, that's okay. That's your choice. So the framework that I talk to them about is needs, wants, and compromises. And I say, write 3 columns and a heading of each column. One is needs, one is wants, one is compromises. In the needs column, write down what your absolute fundamental needs in life are. So they might be a roof over my head, food on the table, my kids to be brought up in, the way I want, so well educated and safe and all the rest of it. That list is almost certainly shorter than you're thinking, because I'm not talking about luxurious food on the table, and I'm not talking about a luxurious roof over your head. I'm saying a roof over your head, a good roof over your head. The wants column is all the stuff you want. It's a holiday a year, 2 holidays a year, 3 holidays a year, a boat, a Ferrari, and whatever, and luxurious food on the table. That's a really long list. And then the compromises one is, what compromises would I make if I knew I would get all of my needs and some of my wants? And when you've written a really short list of needs and you said, what I need is to take my daughter to ballet class twice a week. What I need is to most nights sit down around the dinner table with my family and that we get to, have dinner together. What would I compromise? I compromise quite a lot of money for that. I might compromise the promotion that takes me into the global role that takes me away from my family, because suddenly in writing down those needs, I've realized more clearly what my most important thing is. One of my senior coaching clients, we did that exercise, and she said, the thing that I feel sad about is the fact that I'm not always the one taking my daughter to ballet class. And I went, is that really important to you? Actually, yes, it's really important to me. What would you do differently? What would you compromise in order to make that happen? Oh, an awful lot of things. What would happen if the first thing that went in your diary in the week was take my daughter to ballet class? And then she went, that's what I'm going to do. The first thing that goes in my diary. And it was one of the many things trying to fit in the diary, and one of the things that always got squeezed a bit. And she realized she was prepared to make bigger compromises. And that's what I think for the people who are going, I won't. Not because I willfully don't want to change. That's a different issue. But they're just not kind of making it happen. I go, make the needs list shorter and be much more ruthless with the compromises. We've just moved house in the UK. So we used to live near to London. And our lives, we used to work full-time in office roles, pre-pandemic. And more, our work was moving online, becoming more flexible. We were finding more independence. Now my wife and I both work fully independently. And we suddenly realized that we are having more control of our lives, who we work with, where we work. And then about this time last year, we sat down together and we set out this equation. How could we halve our costs and double our freedom? As a theoretical exercise.
Yes.
Because we were finding that, we were living in a really nice town and we were living in a really nice house. We had really nice neighbors, but there was always a sense of, and it's quite expensive to do this, and I can't give up this particular work, or I have to work with that person that I didn't really get on with that well, whatever it is, because I've got bills to pay. And we felt a bit hemmed in by that. And so we went, well, what would it look like to be in a place where we halved our costs? And therefore you could choose much more. If I don't want to be working with that person, I'll just say no. And so we took a map and we drew a circle. We did some research. And we drew a circle of about a 3-hour drive away from London, to the north, to the west, to the south. Took you to a place where house prices and cost of living is about half. And then we found a place, and then we found a house, and then we put an offer in, and then we moved. And in June this year, we've moved 3 hours drive away from London, and we live in a house that broadly costs half the one we were living in before. It's similar size, actually, because it's 3 hours away from London. So we haven't compromised. We're not living in a shoebox. I can't tell you how much better we feel. We feel healthier. We feel freer. We have a lot more money at the end of the month because all of our costs have gone down. Our compromise is, if we do want to travel to London, it takes 3 hours to get there. So we just have to be a bit more organized, a bit more planned. There's not a lot that we've not been able to do. It's just we've got to plan it a bit more and the travel's a bit more. But we're doing it because we've made some specific choices. Other people wouldn't make that compromise. They wouldn't make the compromise of, a longer commute. And we were featured in the Telegraph newspaper in the UK in a month ago, and they were talking to people that had what they considered quite extreme commutes. Somebody was commuting from Spain to the UK, which I think is a bit crazy. But I say to people, you can choose. You can choose to make those choices. I talked at the beginning about being a professional ballroom dancer, and there's a story that I wrote about in my book that really resonated. So we were based in the UK, training in the UK, but we got to a stage where we were doing a lot of international competitions. So we were traveling to Europe and sometimes to the US and sometimes further afield to do professional ballroom dancing competitions. And we didn't have a whole lot of money. We didn't have sponsorship. We didn't have government funding, anything like that. So the money we earned, we put into our travel, our competition, buying a dress for my partner, buying a tail suit for me, all that kind of stuff. And we would get like the cheapest of cheap, low-cost flights. And we arrived in Prague for the Prague Open one year. And in the UK, a lot of people were saying to us, well, you're really lucky that you've got well-paid jobs and you can afford to go to these international competitions. We don't have as much money as you, so we're not able to do that. And we went, that's understandable. We do feel our privilege, and I'm sorry you don't feel that you're able to do it, but that's okay. And then we went to Prague and we met our friends, Jan Willem and Kendra. And Jan Willem and Kendra were the number 2 professional couple from the Netherlands. And they rocked up in the ballroom. And we went, which flight did you arrive on last night, this morning? And they went, we can't afford the flight. So we drove from Amsterdam to Prague, which is about a 10-hour drive. And this was on a Saturday. And we went, you're staying in a hotel overnight and then you're going to, drive back tomorrow and have Sunday off before going back to work. They said, no. So tonight we're driving overnight from Prague to Paris. And on Sunday we're doing the Paris Championship. And then on Sunday night, we're going to drive overnight from Paris to Amsterdam because we've got to be back at work on Monday morning. And we said, what do you do for work? And she said, well, I'm a student. And he said, well, I'm a welder.
Mhm.
And that's what they did. And we went, oh, that's interesting. So the people in the UK who didn't have as much money, didn't have well-paid jobs like we did, were right in saying they had less than us and therefore less able to travel abroad. But then we met this couple and we went, well, they haven't got anywhere near as much as those couples in the UK. And they're making it work because they figure out a way. And that made me think really hard about, is it that you can't do it? And sometimes it is. Or is it that you're just not willing to make as big compromises as the next person? So when you say it's really important to me to be able to do X, Y, Z, is it as important as you're saying it is? So my challenge to people when I'm working with them is, when you tell me that this thing is really important, what are you prepared to compromise on in order to make it happen? And if the answer is nothing, in reality, then I'm not sure it's as important as you tell me it is. Because if it is that important, you'll find a way to make it happen. And
well, I guess that comes back to what you're saying. It's the values and the purpose, because the trailhead part of this conversation about wanting and what you're willing to do. We talked about two spectrums, those people who have very constrained options because just reality is that. Then you have other people who are talking about compromise, what they're willing to do. In what I think what the linchpin for me is the quality of the question we ask ourselves. In an example of someone who is a very compromised situation where their hands are kind of tied metaphorically, is that it's just what you're saying. They may see the ball of string, but maybe it's to tease one piece of that string out. Maybe there's where you have autonomy. Maybe there's where you have influence or agency to do something. It may be only slight, but that in itself, when I worked with trauma, sometimes that's what it was. That allowed people to feel a level of control, a level of certainty, a level of confidence. Then that would open up their mindset to other possibilities. And I think time and time again, I think that is such a salient point, an astute point you made. When it comes to people making compromise, again, it's the quality of the questions. What are you willing to sacrifice? What trade-offs are you willing to do to take your kid to soccer practice or football or baseball or to see them perform or whatever it is? And again, it comes back down to the quality of the question. And so sometimes maybe we need to be more cognizant of how we articulate the questions to ourselves, because articulating those questions allow us to have a deeper insight into finding more nuanced answers. And I think along this spectrum, wherever we find ourselves in life, right, whether it's compromises or constrained situations, I think everybody has some level of agency. But it's also comes back to, because narrative itself can just be the questions we're constantly asking ourselves. And if they're limited, handcuffing kind of questions, then, well, what are your answers going to be, right? And so, again, I just wanted to come back to the trailhead of conversation, because I think that what you've said in all those examples and the stories you've shared comes back down to the quality of the questions. And it may not be a specific question. Maybe it's a very open question. You need time to sort of ferment and to kind of to process before maybe you have that, as you said at the top of this conversation, a sudden or remarkable moment of clarity. But it's an accumulation of maybe a long process of subconscious or conscious thinking.
I'm smiling because you're so right. And there is a guy that I definitely want to introduce you to. He's called Crotaz. He's an Emmy award-winning filmmaker. And he came on podcast and he was talking about his life's journey of kind of following the threads, following the breadcrumbs. And he said this thing, which has now become the opening to my keynote. I just go, I'm going to show you a minute of Crotaz, a little video clip of him talking. And that's just going to make you think, and then we'll go. And he looks into the camera and he says something along the lines of, we've got to ask ourselves better questions. We've got to ask ourselves more questions. Even when we don't know the answers, we've got to sit with the questions, live with the questions. And he says, because we're not answering our own questions, we're answering society's questions, we're answering our father's questions. We need to spend more time answering the question, asking the question. And we've got to get better at asking ourselves better questions. It's exactly what you said. It's so powerful because when you play that to somebody, they go, oh yeah, I was searching for answers. And I go, don't search for the answers. Just ask great questions. And when you don't know the answer, go, well, that's great. That's great. I should sit with that and allow that to percolate. Now, his story is fascinating because he's lived all over the world, and now he lives in Uruguay. And I said, oh, so how did you get to living with your family in Uruguay? He said, well, that's an interesting story because I follow the breadcrumbs, and I realized for me that I believed in this kind of the sense that sometimes there are signs in life, and you should notice and you should follow the signs. And he said, I was traveling in Uruguay. I wasn't particularly going, is this where we want to settle and do I want to bring my family here? And he said, and then I was walking down the street and I turned and I looked up at the shop next to me, and the shop was called Topaz Home. And he was like, it was a sign. And so I decided that was meaningful and I should bring my family here and set up my home here. And that's what he's done. And I was like, okay, that's bold. And then I went, now I understand your sense of purpose. And your sense of purpose is searching for home. And when we went, you listen to his story and he's gone on this winding path. And in reality, it's all about a search for home, not the home, not where's my house going to be? It's a search for a place that feels like his anchor. So now that's interesting. And it comes to asking, what are the questions that help me to answer where is home? What Topaz does, as well as being a general filmmaker, is he's created this platform called the And Project. And the And Project is about questions. And it has gone massively viral. So he's got 900,000 YouTube subscribers. He's got many, many, many videos on YouTube of these conversations with people that have got millions of views. And it's the simplest thing. He says, I get two people who might be related to each other. They might be father and son. They might be boyfriend and girlfriend. They might be exes. And then they have a pile of cards in front of them, and I've written the questions. I know a little bit about them, and their job is to pick up the card and read the question to the other person. And it'll be something like, when did you first know that we should be together? And he's turned this into a thing that, you can get these cards and do this at home. It comes back to this. Let go of what you think is the right answer and just start asking yourself better questions. And actually this summer, he was in London and he said to my wife and I, come in and do it. And so we've recorded one of these conversations. It hasn't come out yet. We recorded one of these conversations, and I can't tell you, it's a long time since we've been in such an sort of close, intimate conversation about what really matters to us. Because when somebody else has written the question, you can't help but have to answer it. So I think what you said about the importance is in the question, I would bring that back to the unlock moment and say, if I'm doing anything on that podcast, it's shaping a small number of questions that help people to go to a place that they don't normally go to, and through that find new insight, maybe new connections, new threads that they will figure out what to do with. And it's not my job to be searching for that. It's not my job to make the connections for them. It's not my job to help them figure out what to do with what they discover. Just my job is to create a space, to create an opportunity for that to happen. And there's this great coaching quote from one of the sort of pioneers in coaching called Bert Hellinger, who said, have no intention, especially to help. And I really like that idea because, when you ask a great question, you're not asking it because you think you know the answer. It's not a great question if you think you know the answer and you're directing somebody to an answer. It's a leading question. And it's not a great question if you're trying to help them, because that's going to influence what you do. What you should be doing is going, I just ask a question that I know opens their mind. And when you're thinking about the questions to ask yourself, it's the same thing. Ask yourself a question that just opens your mind. Why is that important to me? Is it important to me? Do I want to build a legacy? Do I want to be an expert? Do I want to be famous? Do I want to earn a lot of money? Is that important to me? And you might find, particularly as you progress further through your life and career, that some of those things that you thought were really important to you, it was just society telling you that was really important. And I'm a great believer in this idea that, we've only got one shot at this. We've only got one go on the planet. And everyone's got an opinion as to how you should spend your time. And I'm like, if you decide that you want to go to Nepal and live in a monastery, then you're welcome. And if you decide that you want to, start a business, or you decide that you want to work in a charity, or you decide that you want to be an impoverished writer, it's your choice, Any of those things. An impoverished podcaster in our case.
Well, Gary, thank you very much. You've been very, very generous with your time today. The stories have been enlightening, but very insightful. I found it to be a very stimulating, engaging conversation. But I thank you very much, Gary, for spending some time with me on It's an Inside Job today.
That was my great pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
In the final part of my conversation with Gary, we dove deeper into the unlock moment and its role in personal growth and leadership. Gary shared practical strategies for identifying and embracing these moments, helping us connect with core values and underlying purpose. We explored how clarity during these pivotal moments can empower us to make meaningful decisions, to overcome challenges, and to lead ourselves and others with authenticity. Truly, we spoke about the core of resilience. Gary also provided insights on applying the unlock moment concept to career transitions and navigating uncertainty in both the professional and personal areas of our lives. We discussed how recognizing these moments can foster resilience, adaptability, and a sense of freedom in life's complexities, in its challenges, and its changes. So if you're seeking inspiration to cover your own moments of clarity and purpose, well, this conversation has been filled with actionable insights to guide you on your sojourn along your path. So you have, to your heart's content, you can rewind and replay this. But what I also suggest is tune into Gary's podcast, because he talks about the unlock moment with a variety of guests and personalities from all walks of life. And that podcast is the Unlock Moment Podcast. You'll find the link in the show notes, as well as all the other links to his website and to his social media handles. Gary, I just want to throw a shout out to you for as a thank you, and I'm very appreciative of the time and the knowledge and the experience you shared with me today. It was a deep and meaningful conversation on so many levels. So thank you very much for a brilliant conversation. Well, folks, that brings us to the finishing line of yet another episode. I hope you found this insightful. I hope you found it useful. And if you know someone who could benefit from this conversation, please share the link with them. And if you could take a moment to press that subscribe or that like button. And if you're so inclined and you have that little extra time and effort, please leave a rating. It helps other listeners find the podcast. Well, until the next time we meet on this channel, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.